And I can't see anybody, is that? Oh.
Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. I know we're just all getting settled in the room. I know you're connecting the audios. So I just wanted to welcome again everybody for joining us today. We'll be presenting this webinar on sexual abuse in boys and men and clinical considerations. Our presenter is Dr. Joan Cook. She is a clinical psychologist and professor at the Yale School of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry. And I'll be handing things off to her momentarily, but I would just like to go through some housekeeping information with you all. Next slide, please. So your microphones are muted at the moment, but when we do get to the discussion and questions portion towards the end of this presentation, we can enable that feature. We can turn on your microphones in case you would like to elaborate on a question or just ask your question out loud. But we do recommend using the chat throughout the event if any questions pop up or if you have any technical difficulties. This session is being recorded and it will be available by the next business day, which is tomorrow. And we'll be emailing all of the registrants with that information. So just stay tuned for an email from us. Next slide, please. This is a disclaimer saying that this presentation was prepared for the New England MHTTC under SAMHSA, and you can read more about it when we do post the slides on our website. Next slide, please. And the MHTTC network uses affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all of our activities, and that language is presented here on the screen. Again, when we share the PowerPoint slides with you all tomorrow, you can read it in more detail, because I would like to hand things off to Joan, to Dr. Cook. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joan Cook, and I am a licensed clinical psychologist. I've worked with a range of trauma survivors clinically and research-wise, men and women who've experienced physical and/or sexual abuse across the lifespan, combat veterans and former prisoners of war. And before I was at Yale, I was at Columbia, where I'd work with people who'd escaped the towers or were first responders on 9/11. I love all the populations that I work with. I feel incredibly blessed and privileged. But I feel out of all the trauma survivor populations that I've worked with, that male survivors of sexual abuse and assault are probably the most misunderstood, the least well recognized, and by the public and also by health professionals. And I think because there is that neglect on both sides, or that misunderstanding, that male survivors often tend to not get their clinical needs met. So that's what I'm going to be presenting on today. So briefly, I'm just going to review the prevalence and the potential negative consequences of sexual assault and abuse in boys and men. I'm going to discuss some of the reasons why male survivors may not disclose these traumatic experiences, or they may not seek related mental health treatment because of them. I'm going to highlight how our team at Yale, along with two nonprofits, used a community-based participatory framework to partner with male survivors in research. And rather than present all of that data to you right now, hopefully I'll be invited back to present our comparative effectiveness trial at a later date. The data is still being collected. And what I really wanted to do today, rather than to get heavy into the data, was to really discuss more clinical considerations when working with male survivors. So I may be preaching to the choir here, but if you can, play along, especially if you really aren't aware. So picture this stadium. If this stadium were full of males, approximately how large of a segment of the attendees would you estimate had been or will be victims of sexual abuse? Hold this picture in your mind while we review a couple things. We don't have great data on male sexual abuse. There's much more on female sexual abuse. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Sexual violence is an epidemic, and we need to research it in women as well, for sure. And the rates are higher in women, but they're particularly high in men too. The best estimates that we have of sexual violence in men comes from the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey. Why? Because it's self-report via a phone survey. It's not derived from criminal justice reporting. Sexual violence, as many of you probably know, is the most underreported form of crime. So we can't really rely on FBI crime statistics to give us an accurate picture. The other reason why this data is so good is that sometimes when we assess for sexual violence, we only assess for rape or penetration. And this survey had a much more expansive, inclusive definition of sexual violence, which we'll talk about in a minute, which meant that it has a very much better job of capturing male experiences of sexual violence. I'm only going to go over a few of these numbers and then summarize them in the next slide. If you solely or primarily look at rape, either completed or attempted, you see that the rates are under 2%. But if you look at a more expansive definition of sexual violence, like made to penetrate, like sexual coercion, like unwanted sexual contact, like non-contact unwanted sexual experience, those numbers balloon. So if you think about how many male survivors, if we specifically and solely and primarily use rape, it's less than 2%. But if we use the much more broader definition, a much more accurate definition of sexual violence, we see that that number greatly increases to over 23%. So if we go back to this picture, which was no mistake on my part to have the Penn State Stadium, how many survivors are in this picture, assuming they're all male? Well, at least 1/4, so at least 25%. I don't know about you, but when I first came into the trauma field, I found that number jaw-dropping. That means that by the time they are 18, have experienced some kind of unwanted sexual experience or violence. And that number increases to 1 in 4 across their lifespan. I think we simply don't talk about this in our country for a variety of reasons. But the fact is that boys and men can be victims of sexual abuse and rape. We know a lot from the research literature that people who have experienced sexual trauma also experience other types of trauma and abuse. However, as I said earlier, boys and men who've experienced sexual abuse are largely overlooked, stigmatized, or shamed by the public, and sometimes by healthcare professionals. Let me give you one example, and I'll give you more as we talk about the clinical applications. A number of the men that I have worked with clinically and that have joined my research team on my large comparative effectiveness grant funded by Pcori have said to me that when they called up a mental health clinic or a rape crisis center and identified themselves, they had people who were probably very well-meaning who answered the telephone and said, "What? You're a man. You must be a perpetrator. You can't possibly be a survivor." So even if those people doing that work were very well-intentioned, that was so ill-informed and hurtful to our male trauma survivors that can shut them down for years, if not decades. We also know that male sexual trauma survivors, similar to female sexual trauma survivors, have a whole range of higher probability of meeting criteria for medical, psychological, behavioral, and sexual disorders. And these include things such as PTSD, substance abuse and depression, anxiety, and suicidal behavior. In addition, they have greater and higher rates of sexually transmitted infections, sexual compulsivity, and educational, occupational, and relational difficulties. In addition to these full-blown disorders and difficulties, a lot of the men that come to us for help have some other very prominent psychological symptoms that don't necessarily fit very neatly into any one disorder. They probably go across a number, but they're things that are important for us to recognize, educate, and normalize to them, and help them understand this, connect this to their abuse experiences, and help them heal. These include things like intense anger, especially when they feel threatened or even a fear of betrayal, feeling ashamed, just a dark coat of feeling like they're damaged and no good. They're oftentimes worried about their masculinity or their sexual orientation. We will come back to that. They often have sexual functioning problems, including a low sex drive or erectile problems, or they're engaging in risky behaviors or unsafe sex, sort of like that compulsivity that we talked about a minute ago. They have difficulties trusting others, trouble with sleep, focus, memory, chronic pain, digestive or urinary problems, and oftentimes eating problems or negative body images. I think when we solely pay attention to the DSM criteria that they meet, we miss some of these other things. In addition, I think sometimes when these men come in for therapy and they're hesitant to do some of the therapies that the trauma-informed therapists have, there are other things that we can work on, such as the things, these prominent psychological symptoms on this list, and still be doing good trauma treatment. Male survivors are less likely to disclose or report abuse than females. They're also less likely to identify unwanted sexual experiences as abusive and seek support or treatment. I'll give you an example. So right now, as I mentioned, I've been for the past 2 years collecting data on a large comparative effectiveness trial treating sexual trauma in men. And I do the at least half, I was gonna say the vast majority, and that's not fair to say. I do at least half of the phone interviews of the men coming in. They do a big online screen. Once they screen positive on that, two psychologists, including myself, we conduct the phone interviews. And a lot of these men, when they start off the phone conversation with me, will say, well, I'm not sure if I'll fit in with the other guys, because it's a group related treatment. I'm not sure if I'll fit in. I don't really think my experiences are really abuse. And then they tell them to me just a little bit. I do not ask, that's not part of the assessments, part of the online screen, but I assess the symptoms. And I find that those interviews are also sort of an educational intervention, normalizing for them and saying, no, that is actually absolutely what we would describe as an unwanted sexual experience or abuse. And I think one of the reasons why men tend to do this is because society sort of has many male rapists in addition to this sort of ethos of toxic masculinity. So I think some of the male rapists, and we're going to go through them in a minute, and I'm going to talk to you about them when we talk about clinical considerations for things like men can't be raped, but you and I know that they can. And so we might have to provide that data for them, and again, provide that education. There's a lot of belief that men should just very much espouse a John Wayne attitude. Suck it up, buttercup, put it behind them. They don't need help. Nothing bad happened to them. And so I think all of those things lead to sort of an unwillingness to disclose or to downplay any connection between the unwanted experiences and the long-term impact. In addition, these traditional gender socialization models teach boys and men that they should always be powerful, that they should be invulnerable, that they should never cry or experience sadness, that they should always welcome sexual activity. And I tend to do a lot of reparative stuff in the educational introduction to the people. And I tell the male survivors that I work with that they say, I must be weak for coming into therapy. And I say, absolutely, it's the opposite. You are the strong ones for coming into therapy, to working through and processing these experiences and trying to heal from trauma and live a different life. And I think that's been especially important for them to hear when so many people outside will say things to like, just get over it, or that's no big deal, or that was years ago, or any of the other invalidating experiences they might have when they disclose this type of trauma. So other toxic messages that they sort of ingest from society, from family and friends, are that men should be lucky if the perpetrator was female. Now, I should say that the vast majority of perpetrators of both females and of male assault victims are men. But women absolutely perpetrate sexual violence. They perpetrate it against men as well as against women, but more towards men. And so there's sort of this myth that, oh, well, it's like hot for teacher. If someone, a teacher or a mentor or coach, a female coach sort of, initiated you into the sexual process. No, that's abuse. That's assault. And they need to be provided that corrective information. Sometimes people believe that if they're a survivor, that means they're weak. There are relatively less resources for males, but there are some, and I'm going to share them with you today, and hopefully you can share them with the male survivors you know. And then, of course, there's that myth that men who have been abused will become an abuser and or gay. A lot of times the trauma survivors we see, both male and females, will say the abuse was my fault. I'm not worthy of being helped. I'm broken. If I tell, people won't believe me, or people will hate me, or people will think I reek of my abuse. I'll shame my family. My perpetrator might hurt me or my family. And oftentimes with a lot of the male survivors that I've worked with in the past, they have a physiological, a body reaction sometimes, and will get an erection or have an ejaculation when they are being abused. And so they will internalize that in their mind and misunderstand that and say, well, I must have enjoyed it, so my body betrayed me. And so a lot of the reparative work in the education, the normalization is like, no, that's a physiological response. That does not mean that you wanted it in any way, shape, or form. So I'm trying to think of how many years ago. This was, I think, 5-6 years ago, maybe. My colleagues and I at Yale approached PCORI for an engagement award, and we essentially said, we don't know that much about male sexual abuse survivors' participation in healthcare. We think from the limited literature that it's different from females, but we're not sure. And we'd really like to partner with male survivors and find, like, what's their decision to enter and receive mental health services? What's their disclosure of these trauma experiences like to their healthcare providers? And how do they want to be engaged in research and partnered with us? So we essentially found 2 incredible nonprofit organizations. We have been partnering with them ever since. So we had this engagement award with them, and now we have a large comparative effectiveness trial. The first one is an organization called Male Survivor. They have a wonderful, wonderful website, so I encourage you to go on there. It's started in 1998. It actually started with a number of clinical psychologists, but soon was taken over in a good way, by male survivors and by community and peers. They conduct some clinical and non-clinical trainings around the world. But I think one of the things, and they have a therapist directory, but I think one of the things they do best, which I haven't seen that much of, is that they train other male survivors and they conduct online discussion forums and chat rooms. They're mainly for male survivors, but they're also for family members and loved ones. And many of the men that now work with me as peers and deliver the intervention as part of our clinical trial have also served in that capacity. One thing about that you might want to know, although they're trained and although the men are fantastic, it's not structured. So sometimes there can be a lot of trauma processing content on there, which, as many of you know who do this work, can make people more hyper aroused and understandably make them more distressed at times. The other nonprofit we've partnered with is called Men Healing. I realize I should have put his name at the bottom, the amazing Jim Struve. He's a clinical social worker. He's the executive director of Men Healing, and he is very open about being a male survivor himself. He runs this incredible organization out of Utah, but they go all over the country and they do these weekends of recovery or days of recovery, these retreats. Almost all of the men who've participated as peer leaders in our grant have participated in these weekends of recovery. I have never been. They do have sometimes female leaders as well, as well as Jim. But the men who work with me tell me these things have been seminal and incredibly healing. And another thing that Jim does, and I'm going to show one of them to you, and you can use them clinically in your own work in terms of outreach and in terms of therapy, are these voices of healing. And they are on his website. It's men from across the age across racial and ethnic minority statuses, across sexual and gender minorities, talking about not the details of their trauma, but talking and saying that they have been traumatized sexually and highlighting their journeys of healing and hope. So we partnered with these two organizations. I feel like it's a very equitable partnership. It's been going on for a number of years now. It's based on all the community-based participatory research principles of inclusion and empowerment. We've done a lot of things to minimize power differentials and share power. It's very much a co-learning process. In the first 2 years of the engagement award, we engaged in a number of focus groups. We in person at Yale, this is all pre-COVID, we posed open-ended questions on the male survivor discussion boards, and we would also answer questions and do facilitate discussion rooms. We published some papers on this. We conducted a survey on the Male Survivor website, and we also held discussions at multiple scientific and survivor meetings. And we collaborated on a number of things, including 2 videos. One video is for researchers, basically talking about the importance of including male survivors in our research, and not just as participants or research subjects, but actually as partners, and all of the things they bring to the table. And then we made a video for male survivors talking about, you know, HIPAA and research and all the things they might feel they would need in order to participate as full members, and also a lot of, you know, empowerment and how, you know, we need their voices. We made a nice brochure, and we came up with a repository of top voted research questions that male survivors wanted answered. I'm going to share a little bit of this with you because that is what catapulted us into our comparative effectiveness trial. So essentially the male survivors said to us, like, I want to know, what is the impact of sexual abuse on men's emotional functioning? And is it even possible to be happy? That hit us hard. What is the impact of sexual abuse on men's sexual functioning? What are the resilience factors among men that help to either prevent associated emotional distress or help them heal? How can male survivors who are struggling alone in the community be reached and know that they're not alone? And that came to us. A number of the guys that we met over the years in the focus groups would say, I have suffered for years, if not decades, thinking I was the only one. Please, please reach out to people earlier and try to get those folks into the healing journey. So we logged that in, and that's what we tried with the comparative effectiveness trial. They said, how can male survivors access solid clinical information? Which was really interesting because some of these questions that they were asking about, what's the impact? Now, again, there's much less research on male survivors than there are on female survivors, but we know some things from research. So some of this isn't sort of a research generation question, it's a research translation question. And as such, what we decided to do is publish some op-eds in places like The Hill and CNN and the New York Times, educating the public about sexual abuse in boys and men. And I'll share one example of that. I don't know if any of you remember the incredible band Linkin Park. And a number of years ago, their lead singer, Chester Bennington, had killed himself. And Chester Bennington was very open publicly about his childhood sexual abuse experiences, as well as linking that to his very severe chronic depression and substance abuse. And so essentially, when that happened, I thought, terrible for the world, but a good opportunity for me to educate the public about sexual abuse in boys and men. And I published this piece in CNN. And I think, you know, one thing that sort of spoke to me is that it trended for 3 days on the CNN homepage. And I think that's because people are so hungry for this information. It's very easy to find any of us, right? So it was very easy for people to find me and write to joan.cook@yale.edu, writing to me and saying, you know, this is the first time I've heard of such a thing. I'm a survivor. Can you help me find resources? And I essentially said to my husband, like, you've got the 3 kids, and I'm going to respond individually to each one of these men. And I did, and that felt like the right thing to do, but there needs to be more of us out there sharing that information so that male survivors can come forward and heal. They also asked us, like, what about alternative forms of medicine, meditation, and yoga. I want to know about that. And they said, are there other methods or tools that we can help ourselves heal? They rightly identified that most of the focus groups that we held and many of the peers that are in our comparative effectiveness trial running these large psychotherapy groups online now are white males. And they said, it's hard enough to be a white male, but in addition, it's even harder if you're a racial and ethnic minority or sexual and gender minority or a rural American or an older adult. And so what is the impact of these unique, socio-demographic in terms of males getting engaged in treatment, in terms of them benefiting from the therapy? They also said something, and this definitely influenced our new project, is they said, look, people like you, mental health people, they're okay. Well, some of you are okay. Some of you are really not okay. But what really helped us was the power of peer support. If there's any way you can train us to do the interventions and harness our power to promote men's recovery, we would be really grateful about that. We would want to partner with you on that. And that's exactly what we did. And then again, one of those ones that just hits the heart and hits the gut is, what can be done to prevent sexual abuse of boys and men, including how do we help boys and men identify who the perpetrators are among us? This was a relatively small study done in 2002, not our study, but someone else's, really good quality, but small, trying to understand men's mental health treatment engagement. And they found that male survivors tended to delay up to 20 or 25 years, and that most men didn't ever seek psychological services for a number of reasons, like we talked about, the stigma, and afraid that they were going to be perceived as weak. One of the things that we did, as I talked about on the male survivor website, is we conducted just a small survey. Only 88 people had responded. 60% had been in psychotherapy. Many of them had multiple adverse childhood experiences. As we talked about, these were, polytrauma, polyvictimization survivors. Many of them had PTSD and some form of depression. And when we looked at all of those different factors to see what predicted who was currently in treatment versus who was not currently in treatment, depression seemed the biggest bang for the buck. And so that's what we went for in our clinical trial. We also asked them some open-ended questions. We asked them what were the most and least helpful elements of treatment. Again, they said peer support. This is a different sample now. This isn't our focus group. This is the survey on the website. They said peer support was the most helpful. Individual therapy and validation. They named some specific interventions like grounding and mindfulness. Then they went on to say what wasn't helpful was not having trauma-informed therapists, as well as financial or access barriers. So taken together, what we said from this engagement award is, look, they want us to get out there and help people who are currently not on the healing path or the healing journey. They want us to try to harness the power of peer support. Depression was huge in predicting who was going to follow up with mental health engagement, and there's just not enough on underserved, marginalized populations. So we applied for and received and are just now beginning to analyze the data on a large comparative effectiveness trial on sexual and gender minority male sexual abuse survivors using motivational interviewing, peer-delivered motivational interviewing, and trying to help them get more comfortable with going into formal mental health engagement, as well as reducing their depression. Depression was one of the things that they needed in order to be eligible for the study. Hopefully someday I'll be able to come back and tell you about those or share those through Vanessa, the published publications. Here is one of the men, with permission. Am I allowed to share this? This is on Men Healing website. This is one of the amazing male survivors who is a peer in our PCORI study. And if you'll just be willing to listen to Jeff for just 3 minutes, I would be incredibly grateful, and I believe you'd learn a lot.
My name is Jeff Brandt. I didn't, have any hope. I didn't think there was change possible. But getting into therapy, the change is very possible. It's changed my life, and I have a positive outlook now. I can finally enjoy being around people. My relationship with my children, and even with my ex-wife now, is something that continues to grow. I'm able to open up about things with them, and they can open up to me too. So they know now that I truly love them and truly care for them. And before therapy, with all the hate, and I didn't think I was worthy of love or somebody caring for me. But through therapy, that I did learn that I'm worthy of love and giving out love also. I do oil painting, and I love to go out on site. I like going out in the desert. You can smell the sagebrush. You see little birds jumping around, dancing around. It's just kind of calm, peaceful, and allows you to concentrate on your painting. So it's very freeing. It's good meditation. I've got it all hanging out on the walls in my apartment, and so I can look at it. I look at it every day, and I remember exactly when I did it. And I like them, I really like them. I'm not afraid to challenge myself to try something different now. I'm just more free, I have the freedom to think a little different now, where, I had the blinders on, and this is what I thought art was. And there's so many different ways to do art, but you have to have the freedom in your mind. I'm not afraid to try something different, and that freedom is good. I found that freedom.
So just to show you that among many other things, that healing from sexual trauma is possible and probable at any age with good support. Okay. There's been relatively little research on treatment of male survivors. There was a meta-analysis done back in 2010, and it was looking at the effects of psychotherapy with adults who had been sexually abused in childhood. Only 6 of the 44 studies included men, and of those 6 studies, the majority were female. I kid you not, that's how little there is out there. In a study on male veterans who had military sexual trauma and related PTSD, they were much less likely to receive related outpatient services and receive less intensity of services in the 12 months after screening for military sexual trauma than female veterans. There's also been some incredible work done in the VA showing that males are interested in not having gender neutral information or pamphlets, or better to have gender neutral than female specific, but they really wanted to have male centric and some male specifics to know that they weren't alone. There was also a study done at the University of Cincinnati and the Cincinnati VA looking at the evidence-based psychotherapy for PTSD, cognitive processing therapy. And it was specifically applied to veterans with military sexual trauma. And in general, it looked like, people got better. But if you looked more closer at the data, both in terms of self-acknowledgement of PTSD symptoms and clinician-administered measures, women tend to improve faster and had greater gains than the men. So clearly they need more attention, and we may be needing to do something different in addition. There was a great study done just a few years ago in 2017 to show, it was a survey of a number of therapists who specialize in the treatment of men who've been sexually abused, and said, what are the barriers to helping them come forward? And they seem to organize these barriers in terms of three main domains: intrapersonal experience, social milieu, and the healthcare environment. And all of these things have clinical implications for us doing the work. So the first thing under intrapersonal experiences were painful feelings. These men, as we said earlier, often feel complicit with the abuse. Perpetrators told them that they wanted it, and they may have had a physiological reaction, which they interpreted like, oh God, I must have wanted this. In addition, they have tremendous shame and guilt. They often feel similar to women as, why me? Why was this done to me and not somebody else? And oftentimes people who are abused in the Catholic Church and other religious institutions, or in the Boy Scouts or in fraternities, will have that and say, why me? And then they will find out decades later, it wasn't just them. The predators were going after quite a number of them. There's also the intrapersonal experience of men, that they lack the language and the self-engagement. So they lack the words to describe the abuse and the feelings. Again, when we first started trying to get folks in and recruit folks for our trial, when we only used flyers that said sexual abuse or assault, it didn't seem to be working. But when we changed that to any unwanted sexual experiences, the men were like, well, I guess I could label that as unwanted. And it wasn't until they talked to us and participated in the groups that they realized, oh my goodness, this really was abuse, and I have feelings associated with it. I think oftentimes, very much, again, they try to espouse the John Wayne, man up, and put it behind them, so they don't link their current difficulties, whether it's psychological difficulties inside, or whether it's interpersonal difficulties with a spouse or a boss, to the abuse. So there's a lot of denial, minimization of the experiences, and a dismissal of the links. Again, there's that internalized social stigma. In addition to thinking they need to man up, many of them talk about a vampire theory. They are afraid to tell other people that they were abused, because they believe that if they were abused, that means that they're going to grow up to be an abuser. And the data do not support that. In addition, they're concerned about being seen as gay. Oftentimes they've had negative or adverse or inadequate disclosure responses, people not believing them, shaming them, or blaming them. Sometimes they've had feelings inside of feeling weak, vulnerable, hopeless. And sometimes male survivors who've experienced some kind of sexual violence, will sometimes in their mind think of that as a form of feminization, that they see themselves in some way as less than a man. There's a lot of structural barriers for them coming forward in the healthcare environment, limited opportunities for disclosure, services, as I said earlier, they're not friendly towards men, particularly if men are struggling with their own violence or their own aggression. And I think, providers may not consider sexual trauma in the lives of men, and then respond with inadequate treatment, inadequate diagnoses, maybe seeing pain or somatic symptoms or anger as being, ADHD or bipolar or something else, but certainly not thinking of unresolved trauma issues. There's a lot of relational fear of therapists as authority figures, and difficulties with trust, and afraid to feel exposed. I teach a trauma elective to the Yale psychology interns and the medical residents. And I tell them, when you work with people who have experienced severe and prolonged, complicated trauma, as so many of these men with sexual trauma experience, it is our presumption that they will come into the therapy and have trust with us. And that's just not true. Why should they trust us, right? When so many people in the world have betrayed them. I think in addition, there are some healthcare providers that have some very unhealthy therapeutic strategies, from being unfamiliar, uncomfortable hearing about male trauma, or acknowledging trauma, but unwilling to engage in trauma processing and helping engage with the trauma material. And then that oftentimes reinforces the secrecy and the shame. I'll try to go to a little bit faster, because I know we have about 6 minutes, and then we're going to go into Q&A. there was a great study talking about barriers to listening to male survivors from the vantage point of male survivors. And they again talk about the stigma. They don't know where to go for therapy, the cost, and again, the power differential between the therapists and themselves. There's again, the difficulty. The male survivors are saying the same thing the therapist said. They fear being judged and ridiculed, not being accepted, and they don't want to be seen as just something out of a textbook. Everybody wants to see, and everybody should be seen as a unique individual. Of the things that these male survivors said helped, so this was a research study done, but it's certainly been my clinical experience and my experience in running this large clinical trial, is for survivors, male survivors, having their story heard, believed, and accepted without judgment. They oftentimes in good therapy will change the perspective of the abuse and or of themselves through the course of treatment, recognizing and understanding that they have been abused, having that validated, and recognizing that they were not responsible for what had happened, that someone else had taken advantage of them, that the abuse was not their fault. Understanding the effects of abuse. And then I think as we think about the stages of healing from any kind of trauma, in addition to sexual trauma, developing an identity distinct from the experience of abuse. So learning to live a more meaningful life. And as you saw from my friend Jeff talking about, rekindling aspects of himself that was lost prior to the traumatic experiences, or never having had the experience or the opportunity to develop aspects of himself as an artist. And now he was. So he's not solely a trauma survivor. He's an artist, he's a friend, he's a peer, he's other things in addition to being a survivor. Turning points that other male survivors have said would be influential relationships, professional and support groups, counseling, peer groups, personal relationships. A lot of times the people come to us, they have spouses or friends or family members who say, you know what, you're having some severe difficulties, get help, or I'm out of this relationship. And that has been a pivotal turning point for them to get assistance. So other turning points are the cognitive realizations that abuse was abuse and connecting it to their symptoms, making the correct attribution of blame, that it's not their fault, meeting other survivors. And sometimes it's getting tired of living in pain and suffering, their words, not mine, and facing their own mortality. There's a lot of suicidal ideation and attempts and close calls with sexual abuse survivors in general. So other turning points include the disclosure of sexual abuse to therapists, to family, to friends, to the public, as my friend Jeff just did. Sometimes it's the pursuit of justice, facing an abuser, advocating for helping others, or filing and reporting to the authorities. So what do I think? What do my colleagues and I, what do the nonprofits that we work with think? We have a very tall order that we'd like to see done. We'd like to increase public awareness. We'd like to facilitate positive disclosure experiences. That is, teach family members, teach friends how to give a positive disclosure experience. So, don't cross your arms, don't clench your jaw. When someone tells you they're a sexual trauma survivor, don't say, get over it, or this too shall pass, right? There are things that you can do with both your body and your words to give people a positive disclosure experience. We'd like to really increase the awareness, advocacy, and training of the professional workforce, not just all of us in healthcare and mental health care, but in law enforcement as well. And it would probably be incredibly helpful to help hospital like urology and internal medicine and law enforcement with the collection of evidence. There are some current marketing and outreach things that I can share with you. Some of these are available on the web. We need additional services. We need services and resources for partners and children to help them understand what their parent or family member or spouse has gone through, and help them to come to terms with their own grief and anger. A lot of times men are at a disadvantage because they don't recognize this, they minimize it. So if we don't know about this and educate them, they may get the wrong diagnosis and mistreatment. So you need to screen. I don't mean to tell you what to do, but please consider screening comprehensively for potentially traumatic events, including sexual abuse and assault in the boys and men that you work with. If we don't ask, they often don't tell. I think it's incredibly important for us to establish rapport and trust, provide opportunities for disclosure, and to remember that the goal is not for the patient to disclose all the details of their sexual trauma history, but rather to feel safe, to develop trust, and to be willing to say that they're a survivor and recognize that there may be some unwanted sexual experiences in their life that may be impacting them, and work on it. So, and in addition, what we could help them to do is manage future disclosures to other family members or friends. I realize I have a lot more material, and I know Grisella probably wants to go through, but the next couple slides I have are all on myths that our male survivors may believe and how I work with them to not believe them. Do you want me to keep going forward, or do you want me to open it up for discussion? All right, I'll keep going forward until Grisella tells me what to do. So there's a number of myths that I actually come out and talk to men about. I look for them to and listen for them to say these things, and when they do, I provide corrective information, but I also have a lot of handouts that I give to them too. So one myth is that men cannot be forced to have sex against their will. That is absolutely not true, and we talk about that. They believe that men who become sexually aroused or have an erection when assaulted must have wanted or enjoyed it. Not true. Men often get erections in painful or traumatic situations, and that arousal does not mean that they wanted it in any way. Also, that men should welcome any opportunity to have sex. Not true. They should have the right to consent or the right to reject any sexual experience. Another one is that a man should be able to defend himself against sexual assault. And the truth is that perpetrators against men often use violence, threats, take advantage of intoxication and coercion. So that myth is not true. I often talk about myths about males seeking help. And when they say to me, well, I feel weak, or I feel like I shouldn't cry and experience sadness. And we'll talk about that. Sadness is a basic emotion that all of us experience from time to time, and that seeking help makes you stronger, not weaker, and that it doesn't mean you're crazy. In fact, it means you're incredible and strong. So in general, I like to leave them with this, and hope that I can leave you with this, is that male survivors, you are not alone. It's not your fault, and it is possible to heal, and even probable. It's never too late. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome very much.
We have a couple questions here. One is where people can read more about your study. So, and also if you can share the videos.
Yeah. Should I just send that to you then, some of this research and the videos?
Yeah, if you send to me and Vanessa, we can share at the MHCC page.
Okay.
For sure. And we have a question here. Without therapy, can the male become physically abusive?
Is it possible? Yes, but it's not the most common. I think, and I think that's why a lot of people, again, that vampire theory, it's why a lot of people don't want to disclose, because they are concerned that people will see them as damaged and that they will become predators. And the vast majority of people, if 1 in 4 men experience sexual violence at some point across their life, and 1 in 3 women do, the vast majority of us are not perpetrating violence against someone else. So is it possible? Yes. Is it probable? I'm not sure. It tends to be more, what I've seen more is in terms of anger and depression and sort of what you might think of as sort of like dangerous behaviors. So, and this makes total sense, right? Is they tend to drink more alcohol and take more drugs in an attempt to help themselves, which is very helpful in the short run, right? They get a better night's sleep, or so they think, or they're able to go on the job, or et cetera. But then they have not 1 problem, but they have 2. And I think also too, they tend to get into relationships, friendships, and significant partner relationships where they, I'm trying to think of the right word, where they accept not nice behavior back. So I think a lot of the therapy that I do with them too, and I think that this isn't as common in the trauma treatments that we have, right? A lot of the trauma treatments we have deal with the trauma processing, which is great. And there's lots of randomized controlled trials to show that that's efficacious. But a lot of the people that come to me with help and that I see in the clinical trials have significant interpersonal difficulties and need better skills, setting boundaries in relationships, saying yes to healthy people, saying no to unhealthy people or people who are predator-like. They feel like, you know, that's all they deserve or that's all they can get. In addition, I should have said in the slides, is that once you've been sexually traumatized, there's higher rates of re-victimization, right? So there's that vulnerability in not having the protective skills to recognize danger when you see it and not being able to protect yourself. So those are skills that, you know, if people don't learn from us in therapy, where else are they going to learn them? So I'm a very active, engaged, skill-based therapist, if that makes sense. Was that too long-winded?
No, thanks so much. Is there any relationship between substance use and abuse and trauma?
For both men and women. So both men and women who have had sexual abuse histories, whether it's childhood or adulthood, have much higher rates of abuse of alcohol and drugs. In fact, there's whole treatments in the trauma psychology or mental health field looking at the relationship between those two and saying, you know, years ago when people would come in for therapy and they, you know, had an addiction and they had a trauma, we'd say, oh, you've got to get clean and sober before we ever talk to you about the trauma. And we know that that just sets them up to fail because we're never helping them address the root cause, right? So there's a lot of therapies now that address both of those things simultaneously. And there's a number of really good treatments that I could give you that you could put on your resource page.
Thank you. So any questions, please?
I think so. I think you have to unmute. Is it Camille?
Yes, I'm sorry. Can you speak just a second about sexual compulsivity? Or is that sort of in the same area with other types of addictions?
I think of it in terms of other addictions, but it seems to be one that's even less that men want to talk about. You know, they're more apt to talk about alcohol and drugs than they are to admit to the compulsivity. That is something that they have tremendous shame about. Now, to you or I, it makes complete sense why that behavior might be occurring. So the first thing is to get it out on the table and discuss it and to help them find compassion for themselves and not judge themselves for such behavior. There's some great work actually by the man that I trained with in graduate school named Steve Gold. And he's actually written a book. It's on its second version. It's called Not Trauma Alone. And it sort of talks about that we don't just do the trauma processing, because for many of these people, they grew up in families with deprivation, with not having the skills. So we need to provide them the skills too. He also is an expert in sexual compulsivity and has written several papers. So I can give them to Rosella. They might be even available online, but I'll give them to her so she can give to you. But his name's Steve Gold.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. I kind of can't read the chat, so I'm sorry that I'm not. I can go through these if you want me
I have a
to.
question.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Larry has the question.
Okay.
Yeah, hi.
Okay.
Larry Fernandez
Hi.
with UCLA's Public Mental Health Partnership. So my background with the intense mental health population in Los Angeles has also included a lot of work with gang involvement, individuals, and a lot of prison population,
Yes.
historical, cultural family members, or whatever the case may be. One of the things that I see often happening with this population, whether it was the direct trauma or the extension of the trauma, is the definition of the rape or the actual event and how it's normalized or actually just swept under the rug. So the question is, resources or just kind of a leeway, if you will, into redefining the experience and getting back into maybe a healthier definition of relationship or companionship or even love, if you will, that takes us away from the experience?
I wouldn't say we have any easy sort of like brochures or about that, but there's a great book by Richard Gartner. I think it's called Sexual Abuse of Boys and Men, but I'll send that to Grisella. He's based out of New York City, and he was one of the first, I think he might be retired now. He was one of the founders of that male survivor nonprofit. And he talks about that a little more detail, but that's certainly something that we need to work on with them. I agree with you. Too many people sweep it under the rug, or they minimize it, or say, this just happened, or they even, I wouldn't say repress it. I don't think any of us totally repress. I think we minimize it and tend to, not acknowledge it to self and others.
Right.
But for sure, needing to have better relationship skills.
I was just going to comment that in one of the few research materials that I found, there was a study in 2008 that was identifying the Bureau of Prison. I'm not sure the title. Identified about 918 individuals, right? However, once there was an actual study done, the numbers were over the 200,000 mark, right? So we went, just like your video or your picture, if you will, of the stadium, right? We went from a small scale to a larger scale. And again, it just kind of talks or leads back to your point of.
Yeah. I mean, it's sexual violence in men and women, right? It's an epidemic in our country that we're just not sadly dealing with. And it's even higher in prison populations. It's awful, god awful. I don't know anyone who is doing that work, that very important work. In fact, there's relatively little on, research on male trauma survivors. I just can't find that much research funding for it either, or foundations that are interesting. So, yeah.
Right. And my last point was just going to be that the reason I also bring it up is I'm sure here in California, but in many other states, the undocumented population, which is unaccompanied minors, many of them who are of the age of adolescence and above, are also coming to the United States already with the jail experience and a prison mentality experience. And so we're having a lot of that already kind of presented to us in the forefront, and it's been unhidden.
So Larry, this might not be fair, but I think this is a good idea. People like me need people like you. You need to elevate your voice. Can you please consider writing that up for some kind of publication? Because I have not seen that documented in literature, whether you write it up for an opinion piece or whether you write it up for the clinical literature, but that is important, and we need to shine light in that area.
Sure, I think that'll be important. Yes, I hear you completely. So maybe I can get your email, and maybe I can, brainstorm a little bit with you, and I would love to.
Yeah, that's if we don't help speak for some of these people, they don't have access, to outlets, and we have a bullhorn that we can use through writing. So yeah, totally reach out to me, and I will help you with that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Larry. I sent to you an email. So I would like to thank you, all of you, for this amazing conversation today. Thank you, John, so much. Just like I was sure this conversation will be wonderful. So just to give you a feedback on the chat, you have people say welcoming, thank you. You have we'll have here people from California, Mississippi, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Colorado. I don't know, many states in the United States it's joined this webinar with us right now, and that's beautiful. Please feel free to come back anytime that you want to continue this conversation. I think we have a lot of need to talking about that. I would like to ask all the participants to answer a post-event survey. So it is important for this grant, we want to listen to you, we want to get in touch with you. Please feel free to contact myself and MHCC if you have any questions. So tomorrow we will see this presentation and the PowerPoint, and as soon as we can work with all the resources, we will put this together and also share in our page. And hi to Ohio. Thank you very much.
Nice to meet you. Thank you for the work you do.
Thank you.